Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Today we will be examining the story that began the Buddhist path. The prince leaves the palace at midnight, abandoning everything that is commonly considered happiness. He leaves behind wealth, power, and security. He leaves a wife who loves him and a newborn son who will grow up without him. He does not take things with him, he takes questions that do not allow him to breathe easy. This is not a verbal promise of peace and happiness. It is an approach that offers not faith, but verification through one's own experience, observing how thinking works, how the sensation of a separate I is assembled, and how tension and pain are constructed from this step by step. Before we begin, if this calm and educational pre-sleep format helps you, please like and subscribe to Nomad of Dreams. This helps the channel grow and find its people. Have a good day, or a peaceful night if you are listening before bed. And just out of curiosity, where in the world are you listening from today? Write your location and the time where you are now in the comments. It is a pleasure for me to see how this small corner of contemplation reaches across continents and time zones. Take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, so that it is easier for your body to release tension. From here, we will move very steadily, from the simple to the precise. The prince leaves the palace at midnight, leaving behind wealth enough to buy entire countries, a wife who adores him, and a newborn son who will never know his father. He takes nothing with him except questions that burn the consciousness like acid. In a few hours, he will exchange silk robes for rags, a comfortable bed for the ground in the forest, and guaranteed food for the uncertainty of begging. Most people would say, this is a story about a man who has lost his mind. History calls it the birth of one of the most precise and insightful investigations into the nature of reality. From this radical experiment with human consciousness grew not just a teaching that consoles the suffering, but a system that dissects suffering like a master surgeon, revealing its hidden anatomy and precise mechanisms. This is not just another spiritual philosophy promising peace and happiness. It is a complete manual for psychological liberation, tested over 2,500 years by millions of practitioners, and refined by generations of observation. What follows is perhaps the most profound analysis of human consciousness ever made. It offers not faith, but experiments that can be conducted in the laboratory of one's own mind. It does not show you what you need to think, but how thinking works at all, how suffering is produced, and how the sense of a separate I is assembled moment by moment. Right inside awareness, the genius of the Buddha lay not in mystical experiences, but in his ability to dissect those experiences with almost scientific rigor. Unlike many teachers who spoke in metaphors and poetry, he opened up consciousness like an experienced anatomist, identifying the component parts and showing how they work together to create both suffering and liberation. This is exactly why Buddhist psychology is so practical and verifiable. Any observation can be checked directly through experience. The foundation of the entire system rests on 4 observations. They sound almost obvious, yet they are so deep that they can completely restructure how consciousness relates to reality. These are called the 4 Noble Truths. However, the word truth here is not entirely accurate. In the original language, the meaning is closer to noble realities or clarifying insights. These are not beliefs to be accepted. These are realities to be investigated and seen directly. The first noble truth states, in life, there is dukkha. Usually, this is translated as suffering, but the meaning is broader. It encompasses the entire spectrum of unsatisfactoriness, the feeling of not quite right, that something is missing or not fitting together perfectly. The Buddha arrived at this not from pessimism, but from a very honest observation of how consciousness actually works. He noticed that even pleasant experiences carry within them a slight tint of incompleteness, as if something is still a tiny bit off, never perfect. Take a simple experience. You eat when you are hungry. The first few bites provide real satisfaction, but then something interesting happens. The pleasure gradually diminishes. Then the eating becomes mechanical, and if you continue too long, it even becomes unpleasant. The problem is not the food or the hunger. This is how any conditioned experience is structured. It arises, reaches a peak, and inevitably declines. And consciousness begins to search again for the next source of satisfaction. But the Buddha's analysis goes deeper than this obvious pattern. He identified 3 levels of dukkha that are simultaneously present in almost any experience. The obvious suffering that everyone recognizes immediately, physical pain, emotional anguish, the misery of losing what you love, the irritation of not getting what you want. Nothing needs to be explained here. This suffering announces itself loudly, much more subtle and therefore more dangerous. This is the suffering caused by the impermanence of all conditioned things. Any pleasure already contains the seeds of its own decay. Any happy moment is simultaneously a movement toward the end of that happiness. Because of this, a subtle but constant anxiety appears, seeping even into the most pleasant experiences. It is difficult to fully relax into pleasure, because some part of you already anticipates the loss. Think of falling in love. It is one of the highest peaks of joy in life. But even at the height of romantic happiness, there is usually an underlying layer of insecurity. How long will this last? What if he or she changes their mind? What if I am not good enough? These anxieties arise not because something is broken, but because consciousness intuitively senses the impermanence of any conditioned experience. The more valuable something becomes, the more vulnerable you feel in the face of possible loss. This penetrates deepest of all and is, in fact, one of the Buddha's most original psychological discoveries. This is the suffering of being a conscious being, who is continuously involved in the process of becoming, even when everything is externally fine, even when circumstances are good. A basic restlessness and internal shifting remains in ordinary consciousness. This is not necessarily a neurosis or a psychological breakdown. It is the natural result of consciousness identifying with patterns that are constantly changing. Imagine you are trying to build a stable identity on shifting sand. Any thought disappears almost immediately. Any emotion turns into something else. Any bodily sensation is constantly changing. Your beliefs evolve, your preferences shift. Memory fades and distorts details. Even the body almost completely renews its cells roughly every 7 years. And yet, something in consciousness is constantly trying to find a solid point in this flow, trying to fix a permanent landmark in an ocean of change. This constant attempt to make the fluid solid creates background tension. The Buddha noticed that this third level is so fundamental that most people do not recognize it. It works like background radiation, coloring every experience with a slight sense of incompleteness. This is why even people with comfortable lives, loving relationships, and meaningful work often feel that something vital is missing. This is why achieving long-awaited goals often provides less satisfaction than expected. This is why consciousness is always looking for the next thing, the next experience, the next achievement, the next solution to the riddle of existence. At the same time, the Buddha saw how different levels of dukkha reinforce each other. Consciousness builds complex strategies to avoid explicit suffering, but these strategies often reinforce more subtle forms. The pursuit of pleasure as a way to escape pain creates attachment, and attachment increases vulnerability to the suffering of change. The attempt to build a secure identity creates rigid patterns of thought and behavior, thereby intensifying the suffering caused by the constant need to maintain what is naturally fluid. He also noticed that consciousness tends to blame external circumstances, and therefore endlessly tries to rearrange the world, instead of understanding the internal mechanisms of unsatisfactoriness. People change jobs, relationships, cities, and belief systems, thinking that the right external configuration will finally provide lasting satisfaction. But since the root of the problem lies in how consciousness relates to experience, rather than in the content of the experience itself, External changes provide only temporary relief. Then the old patterns return. The first noble truth also demonstrates the radical difference between the Buddha and many traditions of his time. Most religions then were about union with cosmic forces, appeasing gods, or purifying the soul for a better afterlife. The Buddha focused on something else, the precise mechanisms through which consciousness itself creates its own suffering. The approach turned out to be more therapeutic than mystical, more practical than metaphysical. His analysis shows that suffering is not a punishment for sin, not the result of cosmic injustice, and not even something primarily caused by external circumstances. Suffering is a byproduct of specific mental processes. They can be observed, understood, and ultimately transformed. This moves suffering from the realm of theology into the realm of psychology and cognitive science. Liberation is not about restructuring the world or appeasing invisible forces, but about understanding the mind and working with it skillfully. The Buddha also recognized that different people experience these three levels, with different intensities depending on circumstances and psychological maturity. A person with a severe illness or in poverty will primarily encounter obvious suffering. A person with external comfort but high sensitivity may feel the second level more strongly, the subtle anxiety and impermanence of pleasures. And a person with more developed attention may recognize the third level, the background and satisfactoriness that remains even amidst relative prosperity. This evolved into the idea of gradual teachings tailored to different levels of understanding and different temperaments. The Buddhist path offers practical methods for working with obvious suffering through ethics and basic meditative techniques. It provides more advanced practices for those ready to explore the subtle suffering of attachment to changing conditions, and it offers the subtlest methods for those prepared to see the deepest level of suffering embedded in the very structure of ordinary consciousness. The first noble truth concludes with perhaps its most vital admission. The recognition of suffering should not lead to despair or surrender. Instead, it should create what the Buddha called spiritual urgency, a motivation so profound that it sustains the effort required for complete psychological transformation. When you clearly see how much energy is wasted on trying to avoid the inevitable, you naturally begin to seek more skillful ways to live. When you realize how much suffering is born from senseless resistance to reality, you become genuinely interested in learning to work with reality exactly as it is. The second noble truth is one of the Buddha's most psychologically subtle observations, one that Western psychology did not catch up to for more than 2,000 years. Having identified the universal presence of suffering in conscious experience, he shifted his focus to the causes. He found not a list of external factors, but a precise internal mechanism that operates constantly, often below the threshold of ordinary awareness. This mechanism is called tanha. It is usually translated as thirst or craving, sometimes as passionate desire. But the meaning is subtler and broader than simply wanting something. Thirst is not just desire, it is a quality of desperation that can permeate any desire. It is the feeling that your psychological well-being depends on, whether you obtain a specific experience, whether you can hold on to it, or whether you can manage to avoid some other experience. The Buddha identified three types of thirst that operate simultaneously in the ordinary mind. Each creates its own form of suffering, and each reinforces the others in complex feedback loops. By understanding them, you gain a map of how consciousness traps itself in unsatisfactoriness. This is not only sexual desire, but the entire spectrum of ways in which consciousness seeks satisfaction through the five senses. It is the anticipation of delicious food when you are hungry, the desire for physical comfort when you are uneasy, the pull toward beautiful sights, sounds, and textures. This thirst seems natural, even necessary for survival. Because of this, it is incredibly strong, and most people never question it at all. But the Buddha's analysis reveals a crucial point. Satisfaction from sensory thirst is always temporary and, over time, requires increasingly stronger stimulation to provide the same level of pleasure. This is not a moral judgment, it is a description of how consciousness actually works. when it becomes dependent on external stimuli to feel okay. The first piece of chocolate is delightful, the second a bit less so, the third even less, until eventually, it becomes mechanical or even unpleasant. More importantly, sensory thirst creates a relationship of dependency between consciousness and external conditions. When you need specific experiences to feel whole, you become psychologically vulnerable to whether those experiences are available. This manifests as anxiety when the desired object is absent, clinging when it is present, and a constant search when it is missing. The mind becomes like an addict, needing regular doses of the pleasant to maintain internal equilibrium. This operates deeper than sensory desires and is therefore harder to recognize. It is the constant urge to establish, maintain, and expand the sense of personal identity. It is the desire to become someone important, to achieve something permanently, to leave a lasting mark. But there are subtler forms. The need to be right in arguments, the habit of defending one's opinions, the urge to maintain the integrity of one's self-image, the necessity of being consistent in one's own story. This thirst reveals the desperate attempt of consciousness to create something permanent out of that, which is inherently impermanent. Any thought disappears almost immediately, yet the mind tries again and again to build a stable identity out of these vanishing events. Every role changes according to circumstances, yet consciousness still searches for a stable who I am. Every achievement eventually becomes yesterday's news, yet the urge to become someone never ceases. The Buddha noticed that the thirst for becoming creates a specific form of suffering, almost invisible to the ordinary mind. It manifests as a chronic dissatisfaction with the present moment, because in the present moment, there is never a fully realized personality that the thirst is trying to validate. You are always becoming, but never seemingly arriving at that imagined state of a full, completed self. There is a sense that real life is always ahead, and satisfaction will come when you finally become who you are supposed to be. This is perhaps the subtlest and therefore most dangerous form of thirst, because it often masquerades as wisdom or spiritual insight. It manifests as the desire to escape the difficulties of conscious existence, through various forms of numbing, avoidance, or switching off. It is the wish for problems to just disappear, for heavy emotions to stop rising, for complex circumstances to magically resolve without your involvement. Sometimes this is seen crudely: substance abuse, compulsive entertainment, or workaholism as a form of avoidance. But there is also a clever version capable of deceiving even experienced practitioners: the spiritual seeker who wants to transcend the human. Rather than learning to live with the human skillfully, the meditation student, who uses mindfulness to suppress difficult emotions, rather than understand them, the philosopher, who retreats into abstractions to avoid dealing with the messy reality of relationships and responsibility. The Buddha showed that all three types of thirst share one common structure. In all cases, consciousness projects its sense of well-being onto something else, something other than the quality of awareness in the present moment. Whether you want pleasure, whether you want to become someone, or whether you want to vanish, the mind is always looking out there for what can only be found in the quality of awareness itself. This creates a constant psychological displacement, the feeling that you are always not there, and not then. But the Buddha went even deeper into the mechanics of how thirst works in real time. He described a precise sequence of events that happens thousands of times a day, and is usually unrecognized. The sequence begins when one of the 6 sense organs, in the Buddhist sense there are 6, as the mind is also considered a sense organ, comes into contact with an object. The eye sees light, the ear hears sound, the mind encounters a thought or memory. This contact immediately triggers a feeling tone: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This arises automatically and, in itself, is not yet the problem. The problem begins next. Based on this tone, thirst automatically arises in one of its 3 forms. If the contact is pleasant, sensory thirst arises the urge to repeat or intensify the experience. If the contact threatens the structure of the ego, the thirst for becoming is triggered, the urge to defend or expand the sense of I. If the contact is unpleasant or overwhelming, The thirst for non-existence appears, the urge to avoid or escape. All of this happens in milliseconds and usually goes unnoticed. Once thirst has arisen, it almost immediately triggers what the Buddha called upadani clinging or grasping. This is where thirst stops being a mere impulse and turns into an active attempt to manage experience. Clinging manifests as internal commentary, stories about what this means, plans for how to get more or how to get rid of it, comparisons with the past, and projections of consequences. The mind becomes hijacked by these secondary actions and loses contact with the direct experience from which it all began. The Buddha identified 4 types of clinging that grow out of the 3 types of thirst. 1. Clinging to sensory pleasures, not just physical desires, but the whole spectrum of grasping at the pleasant. 2. Clinging to views and opinions, both philosophical beliefs and everyday notions of how things should be. 3. Clinging to rules and practices, a rigid attachment to moral codes, techniques, and habitual patterns of behavior. 4. Clinging to theories of the self, the ways in which the mind tries to validate and hold on to a solid personal identity. Together, these forms of clinging create what the Buddha called the wheel of becoming, a self-sustaining cycle that keeps consciousness in a mode of searching and unsatisfactoriness. Every act of clinging creates calm, intentional actions that shape future experience. These karmic formations then influence how consciousness meets new experience, pushing it towards specific kinds of thirst and clinging. A loop is formed. Past clinging influences current perception, which triggers new thirst, which creates new clinging, which influences future perception, and so on. The Buddha also showed why attempts to satisfy thirst simply by getting what we want are ultimately futile. Thirst isn't actually about the objects it desires. It is about the attempt of consciousness to create a sense of security and wholeness through the control of experience. But experience, by its nature, cannot be controlled. It is constantly changing. Therefore, thirst is structurally designed to fail. It is like trying to hold water in your palms or pin down a shadow. The harder you try, the more elusive satisfaction becomes. Even worse, every act of thirst strengthens the neural and psychic habits that subsequently create even more thirst. Satisfying sensory desires reinforces sensory thirst. Struggling to maintain a self-image reinforces identification with that image. Avoiding the difficult reinforces the fear of the difficult. Thirst is fueled by both satisfaction and frustration, and it grows from both. That is why people can achieve everything they ever wanted, and still feel a profound internal unsatisfactoriness. The second noble truth ends with a radical reimagining of responsibility for one's experience. Many approaches in therapy and spirituality focus on external conditions, processing the past, or on better coping strategies. Buddha's approach is about something else. To understand the exact moment-by-moment mechanics through which consciousness creates its suffering, attention shifts from what is happening to how I relate myself to what is happening. Freedom turns out to be not in obtaining the right experiences, but in learning to be with any experience, so that well-being does not depend on the experience having to be different. The promise of total liberation. Part 3. The promise of total liberation. The third noble truth makes perhaps the boldest statement in the history of psychology. Suffering, which seems inevitable and woven into the very fabric of conscious existence, can end completely, not temporarily, not partially, not because you have achieved ideal external circumstances, but because the very structure of how consciousness works changes. This state of total liberation is called nirvana. The word is so worn out by pop culture that the original meaning is almost lost. Nirvana literally means extinction, blowing out. Like when a soft breath extinguishes a candle flame. It is not consciousness itself that is extinguished, but the impulsive psychic processes that keep consciousness in cycles of thirst and dissatisfaction. It is not unconsciousness, not emotional freezing, not a withdrawal from life. It is consciousness liberated from the mechanisms that create suffering. Clear, responsive, alive, but without the desperate need for reality to be different. The description of nirvana breaks almost all familiar ideas of what a good life is. It is called an unconditioned state. It does not depend on whether certain circumstances are present or absent. It is called deathless not because the body becomes eternal, but because the psychological sense of dying, which is associated with endless becoming and decay, ends. It is called the highest security, not because threats disappear, but because the internal vulnerability that makes threats painful disappears. But Buddha spoke not only poetically, he analyzed exactly what changes during liberation from thirst and what remains. The six senses continue to function normally. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and mental phenomena. A pleasant and unpleasant tone of sensations continues to rise. The body continues to have needs. Preferences continue to exist. Practical decisions still need to be made. Something else disappears. Compulsive reactivity, which usually follows these natural processes. In a liberated consciousness, pleasant experiences are valued without clinging. Unpleasant ones are acknowledged without resistance. Neutral ones are met evenly, with equanimity. Preferences exist, but they are light. Operational, they turn into a source of suffering. One can want something without turning it into a matter of emotional survival. One can dislike something without becoming obsessed with changing it immediately. One can live fully in any circumstances without making well-being dependent on the fact that circumstances must be different. Buddha described this transformation through metaphors that show different sides of liberation. Nirvana is like a fire that went out not because it was violently extinguished, but because it burned up all available fuel. The fuel of suffering is thirst. When thirst naturally ends through understanding, and not through suppression, the fire of suffering goes out by itself. There is no violence in this, no compulsion, no struggle with the natural processes of the mind. It is more like a fever breaking than winning a battle. Nirvana is also described as crossing to the far shore across a great river. The near shore is ordinary consciousness, trapped in cycles of searching and dissatisfaction. The far shore is consciousness free from these cycles. The river is the path of practice itself, the systematic training that makes the crossing possible. Having crossed, you are not obliged to drag the raft all your life, but you do not lose the skills of crossing either. Liberation includes the path and simultaneously goes beyond it. And perhaps most importantly, nirvana is described as the cessation of becoming. This is about the end of the consciousness's desire to build and maintain a separate self. In the ordinary state, vast psychic energy is spent on protecting, improving, and demonstrating the ego structure. Internal conversations go on endlessly. Who are you? How do you look against the background of others? What needs to be done to support the self-image? How to ensure that others see you the way you want? In a liberated consciousness, this self-service project simply stops working. Energy that was associated with self-care in a bad sense becomes available for direct contact with reality as it is. Buddha showed, liberation occurs through understanding, and not through achievements. You do not become free by acquiring something new. You become free by seeing through what was not actually there as a separate entity. The separate self, which seems so solid and important, is revealed as a construction, a process, not a thing, a verb, not a noun. When this is seen clearly, it does not need to be destroyed or transcended. It simply ceases to be a problem because it turns out that there was a misunderstanding the whole time. This is one of the most radical divergences from other spiritual traditions. Many mystical paths speak of merging with something greater. The Buddhist path says, the one who was supposed to merge never existed as a separate entity initially. There is no one to liberate, because liberation is the recognition that the one who needs liberation was an identification error. At the same time, this recognition does not lead to nihilism and meaninglessness. On the contrary, it opens up natural compassion and wisdom that were always there but were closed off by the project of serving the separate self. When consciousness is no longer occupied with protecting and improving a separate identity, it naturally becomes more responsive to the well-being and suffering of all living beings. Ethics becomes spontaneous, not forced. Wisdom is natural, not accumulated. Love is unconditional, not strategic. Buddha also distinguished between temporary and irreversible levels of realization. Temporary states of liberation can appear in meditation or in moments of strong insight, as a taste of what is possible. But full liberation is a deep restructuring of consciousness that can no longer be rolled back. Not because the person becomes perfect, but because the basic misunderstanding that creates suffering is seen so clearly that it can no longer be unseen. This is compared to the fact that it is impossible to continue believing that a rope is a snake. If you have clearly seen that it is a rope, one can still flinch if one unexpectedly bumps into a rope in the gloom, but it will no longer be a full-fledged belief that takes over. Likewise, a liberated consciousness can have brief preferences, emotional reactions, physical discomfort, but this does not create secondary suffering due to resistance and thirst. Everything is experienced as natural phenomena that arise and pass away in awareness, and not as problems that need to be urgently solved. The teaching on liberation also answers the question of motivation after the cessation of thirst. Many think if the energy of desire disappears, life will become flat, boring, meaningless. But Buddha's description says the opposite. When consciousness is no longer connected with the self-service project, it becomes available for a much more creative, spontaneous, and vivid participation in any circumstances. Actions come from wisdom and compassion, and not from compulsion and need. Therefore, they often turn out to be both more effective and more deeply satisfying. The third noble truth ends with recognition. Liberation is not a reward for good behavior, and not a gift from external forces. It is the natural result of understanding how suffering is created, and the systematic removal of its causes. Therefore, the Buddhist path is empirical by nature, and not based on faith. Every step can be checked by experience, every insight can be tested by practice. Any statement can be researched by observing one's own mind. Liberation is not something you hope for in the future, but something that can be seen and developed right now, in the current moment, by understanding what is happening in consciousness. Technology of Transformation. Part 4. Technology of Transformation. The fourth noble truth describes one of the most well-thought-out systems of psychological training, a complex methodology that has been tested and refined by 2,500 years of practice. This is called the Noble Eightfold Path. The word path can be misleading because it sounds like a linear movement from point A to point B. In practice, these 8 factors are different sides of one holistic way of living. Each supports the others and is supported by them. Together, this can be called a technology of liberation, a set of tools for skillful work with the mind. The 8 factors are traditionally divided into 3 groups. This is just a convenience for explanation. Wisdom, right understanding and right intention. Ethics, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Mind training, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. But in real practice, all 8 develop together and mutually reinforce each other. Right understanding, the first factor, is the development of accurate knowledge about the nature of reality, primarily about the 4 noble truths and their consequences. But this is not an intellectual theory, not the memorization of facts. Right understanding is seeing directly how suffering is created by your own psychic processes. It is seeing the impermanence of everything conditioned, and understanding how personal identity is constructed. Such understanding manifests only through a consistent investigation of one's own experience, plus the study of those who have walked this path before. Usually, the process moves in stages. First, the theoretical framework. You learn the basic model through reading and reflection. Then, you begin to verify it by observing yourself. You notice in real time how thirst works, how attachment makes one vulnerable, and how identification with thoughts and emotions creates suffering. If the practice continues, understanding becomes intuitive and immediate. You simply see reality clearly without the need to constantly explain to yourself what you are seeing. Right intention, the second factor, is the development of the correct motivation for this work. Buddha identified 3 intentions that support liberation: renunciation, loving-kindness, and non-violence. Renunciation is not about rejecting the world, but about the wisdom to distinguish between what is truly worth pursuing and what only appears to be valuable. It is about understanding that true satisfaction is not found in the accumulation of experiences, achievements, and external approval. When this becomes clear, desires naturally simplify, and attention shifts toward what actually supports well-being. Loving-kindness is a sincere concern for the well-being of all beings, including yourself. It is not an artificial kindness or a moral obligation, but the natural result of understanding interconnectedness. When you clearly see that your well-being is closely linked to the well-being of others, caring for others becomes a form of intelligent self-care. Non-violence flows from loving-kindness, the intention to avoid actions that create unnecessary suffering for yourself or others. This includes both gross forms of harm, violence, and deception, and subtle ones like gossip, manipulation, and passive aggression. Right speech is the third factor. This is about how you use language, both externally and internally. Externally, right speech means avoiding lies, harshness, gossip, and idle chatter, while developing truthfulness, benevolence, meaningful communication, and appropriate silence. But Buddha went further. Speech changes consciousness. Every word strengthens certain neural connections and habits of the mind. Complaints strengthen a focus on problems. Gossip intensifies preoccupation with others' lives. Harshness intensifies anger and defensive reactivity, while truthfulness strengthens clarity. Kindness in speech is compassion. Meaningful speech is wisdom. Internal speech, the quality of the inner commentary, is often even more important. The mind generates thousands of words a day. Dialogues, evaluations, plans, comments. This internal speech shapes the perception of reality moment by moment. Learning to notice and gradually tune internal speech patterns is one of the most practical parts of the path. This is not about suppressing thoughts, but about recognizing harmful internal commentary and gently returning to a more skillful way of being with experience. Right action, the fourth factor, is the alignment of behavior with wisdom and compassion. Buddha named basic things to avoid: killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, unethical sexual behavior, intoxication, and lying. But the meaning is broader. Developing sensitivity to the consequences of any actions. Every action creates a karmic result, affecting internal states and external life. Right action is the choice of behavior that supports freedom, clarity, and compassion, and the rejection of what intensifies suffering, confusion, and egoism. For this, what can be called ethical sensitivities develop the ability to feel the subtle effects of one's choices on one's own consciousness and on the well-being of others. Over time, you notice which actions leave more peace and clarity, and which leave agitation and turmoil. You notice how your behavior affects people, and gradually ethical behavior becomes natural rather than forced, because the benefits are seen directly. Right livelihood, the fifth factor, is the application of right action to the sphere of how you earn a living and build your economic life. Buddha specifically mentioned avoiding occupations involving harm to living beings, for example, trading in weapons, living beings, meat, intoxicants, and poisons. But the principle is broader. Any way of earning that forces you to regularly go against your deepest values, or significantly intensifies the suffering of others. Right livelihood is also about a healthy relationship with money and things, without clinging to wealth, and without a performative denial of the material. In practice, this is often a difficult balance between ideals and necessity. The goal is not perfection, but movement toward greater integrity and less harm. Sometimes this is through a gradual change of jobs, sometimes through changing how you do your current job, sometimes through a more honest vision of the ethical side of financial decisions. The point is that money and spiritual development are not separated by a wall, they are one life. Right effort is the sixth factor. This is about the quality of energy you bring to the practice and to life. It is not about self-violence or white-knuckled discipline. Right effort is the ability to work with psychic energy accurately, giving exactly as much intensity as the situation requires. Too little, and you get stuck in old habits. Too much, and you create tension and resistance. Buddha compared this to tuning a string. A precise tension is needed for the music to sound. He identified 4 applications of right effort: preventing the rising of unwholesome states through mindfulness, and avoiding triggers, abandoning unwholesome states that have already arisen, not by suppressing or indulging, but by understanding them so clearly that they dissolve on their own, developing wholesome states that have not yet arisen, creating conditions for wisdom, compassion, and peace, and maintaining and deepening wholesome states that are already present, valuing them and giving them nourishment so they may grow. Right mindfulness is the 7th factor. It is the ability to observe the mind without getting lost in its content. This is perhaps the most characteristic part of Buddhist practice, and the one that has most strongly influenced modern psychology and neuroscience. Mindfulness is not just relaxation, though it can be relaxing, and it is not positive thinking, though the mood may improve. Mindfulness is a specific skill, maintaining clear attention to the experience of the present moment without falling into stories, evaluations, and reactions regarding that experience. Buddha described 4 foundations of mindfulness: mindfulness of the body, breath, posture, sensations, bodily actions. This grounds one and provides a stable point. When the mind is agitated, mindfulness of feelings, the tone of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality that accompanies any moment of experience. This helps catch thirst before it becomes clinging. Mindfulness of the mind, observing states and emotions without identification, noticing anger without becoming angry, seeing fear without turning into the one who is frightened, seeing desire without becoming driven, and mindfulness of phenomena, seeing how experience arises and passes according to the laws of causality, rather than according to your preferences. This develops a deep acceptance of reality, rather than a struggle with how things should be. Right concentration is the 8th factor. This is the training of the mind, so it can rest on deep stability and clarity, not switching off or becoming unconscious, but developing the ability to hold attention on a single object for a long time, without distraction and without clouding. Buddha described a series of increasingly subtle states of concentration called jhanas. These are not goals in themselves, but powerful tools for developing insight. Usually, everything starts with a focus on a simple object, the breath, or a visual image. At first, the mind constantly wanders, and holding attention for even a few seconds is difficult. Gradually, with regular practice, attention stabilizes and becomes subtler. As concentration deepens, states of profound peace and clarity appear. The natural potential of consciousness manifests when it is not scattered or agitated. These states provide both a refuge from the chaos of ordinary mental activity and a platform for exploring reality with unusual clarity. The Eightfold Path is a holistic training for human consciousness. It touches upon behavior, emotions, attention, and thinking. Unlike systems that rely primarily on beliefs or isolated practices, Buddhism provides methods that change the very structure of one's relationship to experience. The path is deep enough to occupy a lifetime and practical enough to provide tangible benefits to those ready to experiment. And most importantly, everything is verified by experience, not by faith. There is perhaps no topic in Buddhist psychology more revolutionary and simultaneously more difficult to understand than the analysis of what you call yourself. The feeling that you are a continuous, separate entity moving through time is revealed as a construction, a process, not a thing, a verb, not a noun. This insight, anatta, not self, is one of Buddha's most original contributions to the understanding of the human being, and one of the most practically transformative recognitions available to consciousness. This does not mean you do not exist. It means you exist in a way that is entirely different from how it seems to you. The investigation of the self begins with a simple but profound question. If there is an I, where exactly is it located? This is not a philosophical game, but an empirical investigation that anyone can perform. When you begin to search for this I, which seems so obvious and important, what do you actually find? It is in the body, but the body is constantly changing and renews almost all its cells in about 7 years. Yet the feeling of being the same person remains. It is in thoughts. Thoughts arise and disappear constantly, and their content changes significantly depending on circumstances. Yet it still seems that something remains. Perhaps the I is in emotions or personality traits. Well, these two are constantly shifting depending on mood, health, social situation, and life experience. You are one person when tired and another when well rested. You are different with family and different with acquaintances. 10 years ago, you had different views, preferences, and concerns than you do today. And yet, in all these changes, the sense of a continuous identity persists. What exactly is this something, and where is it located? I have completed the translation of this segment. Would you like me to translate the concluding section where the concept of anatta is fully explained through the lens of the 5 aggregate skandhas? Or perhaps you'd like to dive into the practical application of these insights. The Buddha's analysis shows that what we call I is a dynamic process, consisting of 5 constantly changing components called the 5 aggregates, or skandhas: form, sensations, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Form is the body and the material aspects of existence. Sensation is the immediate tone of experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutralizing when consciousness contacts an object through the 6 spheres of perception. Perception is the recognition and interpretation of data from the senses and the mind. Mental formations comprise the entire complex psychic mechanism: thoughts, emotions, intentions, and habitual patterns. Consciousness is the basic knowing quality that makes experience possible at all. These 5 components are constantly rising, changing, and dissolving depending on conditions. In every moment, millions of microprocesses are occurring. The aggregates interact with each other and with the environment. The illusion of a separate, continuous I is created by the mind's tendency to assemble a story of connectedness and permanence out of this continuous flow. It is like a movie. You see smooth movement and forget that it consists of thousands of still frames, rapidly replacing one another. The sensation of a solid, continuous I is a perceptual construct, not a fundamental reality. But the Buddha dug even deeper into the mechanics of how this construction is maintained. He identified a continuous psychological process that sustains the illusion of self. Consciousness constantly identifies with what arises in awareness and appropriates it as I or mine. A thought arises, and immediately the sensation appears. This is my thought. An emotion arises, and it becomes mine. When a sensation arises, it is experienced as this is happening to me. This constant process of identifying with experiences and appropriating them creates the feeling that there is some owner of experience at the center. The problem is that such identification gives birth to a basic contradiction within consciousness. You identify with that which is always changing as if it were permanent. You claim ownership of processes that are essentially impersonal. You mistake conditioned phenomena for an unconditioned self. Because of this, a steady sense of insecurity emerges. You try to assemble a stable personality from material that is, by definition, unstable. It is like trying to build a solid building on quicksand or carve an eternal sculpture out of flowing water. The harder you try to solidify the sense of self, the more shaky and anxious it becomes. The Buddha offered a powerful analogy. Imagine you are trying to hold water in your palms. The tighter you squeeze your hands, the more water leaks through your fingers. The same thing happens when you try to fix a solid sense of personal identity. The more desperately consciousness clings to the I, the more elusive and problematic it becomes. This is why a person can have everything they thought they needed for happiness, and still feel internal instability. The problem is not in what they have or don't have, but in the project itself. The attempt to create security through identification with changing conditions. The understanding of non-self anatta does not come through philosophical reasoning alone. Intellectual understanding can prepare the ground, but it usually happens through long-term meditative investigation, where you directly see that personal identity is a construct. As mindfulness develops, you begin to notice the constant process of identification that usually occurs below the threshold of attention. You catch the mind in the act of appropriating experiences, building stories about who you are based on temporary states, and defending and maintaining the sense of a separate I. At first, this can be very unsettling because it touches the most basic assumption of ordinary consciousness. If there is no solid I, then who is experiencing the experience? Who makes decisions? Who is responsible for actions? Who is practicing the spiritual path at all? These questions show that one needs to completely rethink what it means to be conscious. Experience continues to happen, but it no longer revolves around a separate experiencer. Decisions continue to be made, but they arise from the entire totality of conditions, rather than from a central decider. Responsibility also remains, but it is distributed across a network of interdependent causes, rather than concentrated in a single separate entity. The Buddha answered such doubts by distinguishing between conventional truth and ultimate truth. At the level of conventional truth, it is normal to say I and you, mine and yours, self and other. This is useful for communication, social organization, and moral responsibility, but at a deep level, these conventional designations do not point to really existing separate entities. They are convenient tools, like lines of latitude and longitude. They help us navigate the map, but they are not physical lines on the earth. Understanding this distinction allows one to live effectively in the ordinary world, while simultaneously maintaining an awareness of the deeper truth of interconnectedness and impermanence. The practical consequences of understanding non-self are very powerful and liberating. Most psychological suffering arises from attempts to defend, maintain, and upgrade the sense of a separate I. When it is seen that this is a construct and not reality, a vast amount of psychic energy is released for a more creative and compassionate interaction with life. You can have preferences without being their hostage, have an opinion without needing everyone to agree, and live through an experience without being defined by that experience. The defensive reactivity that so often governs human relationships begins to weaken, because there is less of a sense of a separate I that needs to be defended. The realization of non-self also changes the motivation for spiritual practice. Instead of trying to improve yourself or transcend yourself, you begin to see transparently the self that supposedly needs improving or transcending. Instead of chasing a future state of enlightenment, you understand that the one who would achieve enlightenment is part of the problem that needs to be understood. Practice becomes less about becoming someone better and more about recognizing the illusion that you are someone at all. This shift makes the path simultaneously humbler and deeper. The teaching of anatta also explains why compassion naturally arises as wisdom develops. When the boundaries between self and other are seen as conceptual constructs, rather than fundamental realities, caring for others becomes as natural as caring for oneself. The suffering of others is no longer experienced as something happening to someone out there, but is perceived as arising in the same field of interdependent awareness that includes what you conventionally call your experience. Then ethics ceases to be a set of imposed rules and becomes a natural expression of understanding. The understanding of non-self also provides a different view of death and impermanence. If there was no solid, continuous I to begin with, then there is nothing to lose through death in the sense of something solid and continuous. A specific configuration of the 5 aggregates dies, but the aggregates themselves continue in new forms according to the law of cause and effect. This does not necessarily mean personal survival after death, but it suggests that the sharp division between existence and non-existence that frightens ordinary consciousness is based on a misunderstanding. Death becomes non-destruction it is the dissolution of a temporary pattern in the ongoing flow of natural processes. Everything that exists is in constant motion. It arises and disappears every moment, never remaining the same from one moment to the next. This understanding of universal impermanence, Anicca, is one of the Buddha's most fundamental observations about the nature of reality. But, as obvious as it sounds, impermanence is one of the hardest truths to fully accept and integrate into life. The mind's resistance to constant change creates a significant portion of the suffering we typically experience. The Buddha began his investigation of impermanence with the careful observation of his own experience. Every breath has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every thought arises from nothing, exists for a moment, and dissolves back. Every emotion has a moment of appearance, a peak of intensity, and a natural decline. Every bodily sensation appears, changes in quality and strength, and then disappears. Even the most stable states, like depression or chronic anxiety, if observed accurately enough, consist of a multitude of micro-moments of rising and vanishing. This general principle applies not only to thoughts and emotions, but to everything experienced. The sense of personal identity is constantly changing. New events adjust the self-image. Old memories are erased or reconstructed. Relationships continuously evolve because you change and others change. Beliefs and opinions shift when new experience and information break old assumptions. Even the body is constantly renewing. Cells die and are born. Chemical processes build and destroy molecules. Energy constantly enters and exits. But the Buddha's analysis goes deeper than the simple everything changes over time. He saw that what seems to be continuous existence consists of countless individual moments of rising and decay occurring at a tremendous speed. What you perceive as a solid table is, in fact, billions of atoms vibrating in space and continuously exchanging energy with the environment. What seems like a continuous stream of consciousness is millions of micro-moments of knowing rapidly succeeding one another. At a deep level, reality is more like a strobe light than a steady flame, more like a movie than a still photograph. Understanding this moment-by-moment process significantly changes how we understand the origin of suffering and the possibility of its cessation. Most psychological pain appears from the attempt to make permanent that which is by nature impermanent. You want the pleasant to last forever. You want the unpleasant to end immediately. You want the sense of self to be stable and protected. But the design of existence makes these desires impossible to fulfill. Stopping change is like trying to stop a river or prevent the sun from setting. The effort itself creates tension and frustration but solves nothing. The Buddha identified 3 ways in which resistance to impermanence creates suffering. The first is obvious. Clinging to pleasant experiences that naturally end gives birth to the pain of loss and separation. The joy of falling in love is colored by the fear of losing love. The pleasure of success is spoiled by anxiety over how to maintain it. Satisfaction from achievement is complicated by worry over future failures. This suffering is usually recognizable, but it is rarely understood as a consequence of impermanence rather than specific circumstances. The second is subtler. Resistance to unpleasant experiences that naturally arise imposes additional layers of pain. On top of the original discomfort, physical pain becomes emotional torture when accompanied by thoughts like, "It shouldn't be this way," or "When will this end?" Difficult emotions, sadness, fear turn into psychological problems when consciousness wars with them instead of allowing them to pass through their natural cycle of appearance and dissolution. Resistance creates tension. Tension reinforces resistance, and what could have been a passing cloud becomes a lingering storm. The third is the subtlest and therefore the most common. The background anxiety of simply living in a world where nothing remains stable, even when everything is fine. There is a sense of insecurity beneath it, because consciousness intuitively understands that current conditions are not eternal. This creates a feeling of walking on thin ice. It is difficult to fully relax because everything can change at any moment. This suffering is so basic to ordinary consciousness that many take it as a natural fact of existence. not seeing that it is a result of resistance to the flow of change. The Buddha's approach to impermanence is neither resignation nor denial, but what can be called radical acceptance. This means learning to align consciousness with the natural flow of change rather than fighting it. Radical acceptance is not about passivity or fatalism, but about the wisdom to distinguish what can be influenced skillfully from what must be allowed to take its course. You can create the conditions for well-being, but you cannot control the results, because they depend on a multitude of factors beyond your influence. Acceptance of impermanence usually develops in stages. First, there is intellectual recognition. Yes, everything changes, but emotionally, this is not yet integrated. You know the pleasant will end, but you still suffer when it ends. You understand that difficulties will pass, but you still resist when they arrive. This stage is important as a framework, but it does not yet change the basic habits of clinging and resistance. The next stage, you begin to observe the process of change directly through meditative mindfulness. You notice in real time how thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise and disappear. This gradually weakens the illusion that experiences are solid and permanent, and it becomes easier to let go when changes come. A kind of readiness for change appears, a psychic flexibility that helps one adapt faster to new circumstances instead of getting stuck in how things were before. The deepest integration is when you discover that impermanence is not a problem to be solved, but the very nature of life. Change becomes a source of freedom rather than anxiety, because you see that no difficult situation is eternal, and no pleasant one needs to be convulsively held onto. You begin to appreciate the freshness and creative potential that makes constant change possible. A world without impermanence would be static, boring, and ultimately lifeless. Growth, learning, and development are only possible because nothing remains the same. This new connection with impermanence immediately yields practical effects. Decisions are made more calmly. You understand that no decision is carved in stone, and mistakes can be corrected as new information appears. Relationships become less possessive. You see people as they are now, rather than trying to freeze them in fixed roles and expectations. Planning becomes more flexible. Goals are held more lightly, with a readiness to change them as circumstances shift. Even aging and physical decline become easier to accept. They are seen as natural expressions of the general process of change, rather than as personal failures or an injustice of the universe. The Buddha also used the understanding of impermanence as a tool for working with difficult states. When strong emotions arrive, anger, fear, sadness, the reminder this is not permanent can immediately lower the intensity. Instead of drowning in the story of why you feel this way and what must be urgently done, you can simply observe how the emotion appears, changes, and ultimately dissolves on its own. This does not mean suppressing emotions or pretending they are not important. It means seeing their temporary nature and giving them space to follow their natural path. Insight into impermanence also changes the approach to spiritual practice. Instead of searching for permanent states of peace or enlightenment, you begin to appreciate the dynamism of awakened consciousness. Wisdom is not a fixed trophy, but a fluid response to changing conditions. Compassion is not a permanent emotional state, but a continuous tuning into the suffering of others. Liberation is not a final point, but a process of letting go. This makes the path more humble and sustainable. The pressure to reach an ideal state disappears. Deep understanding of impermanence also reveals the interconnectedness of all phenomena. Nothing changes in isolation, because everything exists in mutual relationships. You change, your relationships change. Relationships change, the people around you change. They change, their relationships change, and the effect ripples out further and further. This strengthens the awareness of how your thoughts, words, and actions affect the constantly changing web of existence. Responsibility grows, but simultaneously it becomes lighter, because it is distributed across the entire web of interdependence. The web without a weaver. Part 7. Nothing exists by itself. This is perhaps the deepest and most far-reaching insight in Buddhist philosophy. What is called dependent origination pratitya samyutada. The principle is simple. Everything arises in the presence of conditions, exists only in interconnection, and disappears when conditions change. Understanding interdependence changes not only the view of the world, but also the view of oneself and one's place in the vast web of being. The Buddha's investigation began with a simple but revolutionary question. How do things appear at all? Most people assume that objects and experiences exist separately, and then interact with other separate objects and experiences. The Buddha's observation showed the opposite. Things do not first exist and then enter into relationships, they arise through relationships. Nothing has a self-contained, internal, independent existence, because everything depends on causes and conditions for its appearance, maintenance, and disappearance. Take a simple example. The experience I see a tree. For this, there must be the presence of a tree, functioning eyes, suitable light, a nervous system capable of processing visual information, past experience that allows one to recognize the pattern of light and shadow as a tree, and a host of other conditions. Remove any one of them, and the experience of seeing the tree will not arise. This experience does not exist separately and then meet the conditions, it appears precisely because the conditions came together. As conditions change or disappear, the experience changes or disappears as well. The same applies to everything experienced, including mental states, emotions, and even the sense of personal identity. Anger does not sit somewhere in the head, like a thing waiting for a trigger. It arises when specific conditions converge. A trigger event, a story about what that event means, bodily tension, memories of similar situations, and other psychological and external factors change the conditions, and the anger changes or disappears. Anger has no existence separate from these interdependent conditions. The Buddha formulated this as the principle of dependent origination. When this is, that arises when this is not, that does not arise. It works on all levels, from obvious physical processes to the subtle psychological phenomena. Seeds sprout when the right conditions exist. Soil, moisture, temperature, light. Thoughts arise when consciousness meets objects through the 6 doors of the senses. In the presence of attention and memory. Suffering appears when thirst encounters impermanence in the context of identification with changing conditions. Liberation arises when wisdom meets thirst against the background of steady, mindful investigation. In tradition, dependent origination is often explained through a chain of 12 links, describing how suffering reproduces itself in cycles of conditioned existence. The chain begins with basic ignorance of the nature of reality, primarily about impermanence, suffering, and the constructed nature of the self. Ignorance gives birth to karmic formations, intentional actions based on misunderstanding, that shape future experience. These condition consciousness, then name and form, then the 6 sense spheres, then contact, then feelings, then thirst, then clinging, then becoming, then birth, then aging and death. This may seem abstract, but it describes processes that occur thousands of times a day. Every moment of unconscious reactivity reinforces mental patterns that shape how you will perceive and respond in the future. Every action from thirst strengthens neural pathways that trigger even more thirst. Every resistance increases the tendency to resist. Every identification with thoughts and emotions makes that identification more automatic and sticky. Suffering maintains itself through these feedback loops. But the same principle also shows the way to break the cycle. When ignorance is replaced by understanding, the entire chain begins to change. If you clearly see how states arise from conditions, you can work with conditions skillfully, rather than being held hostage by them. If you understand how thirst turns into clinging, you can catch the process earlier, before it becomes an avalanche. If you see that identification creates suffering, you learn to hold experience more lightly. The insight of interdependence also shows why personal liberation is inseparable from the liberation of all. Since nothing exists separately, your well-being and the well-being of others are closely intertwined. Your states affect everyone you meet, Their reactions affect their relationships. The effect spreads throughout the entire network, and conversely, the pain and joy of others acts upon you through those same connections. Compassion becomes not just a moral choice, but a recognition of factual reality. Interdependence also changes the notion of personal responsibility. You are not entirely responsible for everything that happens to you, but you are not entirely powerless before external circumstances either. Your actions and states influence the conditions you encounter, but conditions also shape your ability to respond skillfully. You are simultaneously the creator and the product of circumstances, the cause and the effect of your own experience. This leads to what can be called participatory responsibility, taking full ownership of your part in the web of causality, while remembering that your part is always embedded in larger patterns that you do not control. This principle also provides a more accurate understanding of how change occurs in complex systems. Many think that change is linear causality. You decide to act differently and immediately get a result. Buddha's analysis shows change occurs through a gradual shift of many interconnected conditions, often unnoticed. Small, stable changes in one area can over time change the entire system, whereas abrupt attempts that ignore interconnected conditions usually do not last. This has a direct application for development. Instead of trying to break yourself through willpower alone, you learn to create conditions that naturally support the desired changes. Want more patience? You work simultaneously with thoughts, emotions, bodily tension, environment, and relationships, rather than just suppressing the reaction. Want compassion? You investigate the conditions that open the heart and the conditions that close it, and gradually shift the balance toward openness. The same logic changes the attitude toward difficult circumstances and complex relationships. Instead of solid obstacles that must be smashed by force, you begin to see configurations of conditions that can be gradually shifted by skillful actions. A difficult relationship is not a fixed situation, but a dynamic process of two or more people. Each has their own habits and conditioning. Each responds to the responses of the other, and each is capable of influencing the general pattern through choice. This opens up creative options that are not visible if one thinks of independent entities trying to control each other. A deep understanding of interdependence also shows the conventionality of the boundaries of categories that ordinary consciousness accepts as solid and very important: self and other, inside and outside, success and failure, good and bad. This does not make the distinctions meaningless. It simply means you hold them more lightly and use them more wisely. You can function normally within conventional categories while maintaining the understanding that they are constructions, not discovered fundamental boundaries. Buddha used many metaphors to explain interdependence, reality as a net of jewels, where each reflects all the others, and a change in one changes the entire net. Existence as a tree, where roots, trunk, branches, and leaves support the life of the whole. Consciousness as a space in which phenomena appear and which, at the same time, experiences the influence of everything that manifests within it. These metaphors point to a way of seeing that goes beyond habitual duality subject-object, and reveals the wholeness of reality beneath the visible separation. Inheritance of action. Part 8. Every intentional action creates consequences that shape future experience in a precise and observable way. This principle, called karma, is one of Buddha's most empirical insights and one of the most practical teachings on how to live skillfully. But karma in Buddha's view bears little resemblance to the popular idea of cosmic justice, or a supernatural system of rewards and punishments. It is rather a subtle understanding of how consciousness forms itself through choices, creating the very circumstances it subsequently encounters. The word karma literally means action, but Buddha focused specifically on intentional action, a choice made consciously, rather than a purely instinctive or reflexive reaction. Every conscious intent, every word with intention, every behavior chosen from alternatives creates karmic formations that affect how consciousness will perceive and react in the future. These formations work like seeds planted in the field of consciousness. They can remain hidden until the conditions arise for them to ripen into experience. Understanding this provides a precise way to take responsibility for one's psychological well-being and spiritual development. Buddha identified 3 types of karma based on the channel through which intention is expressed. Mental karma consists of conscious thoughts, intentions, and attitudes, especially those we purposefully develop or consolidate through repetition. Verbal karma, not just words, but all forms of communication, writing, body language, and even the quality of your silence in various situations. Bodily karma, any actions of the body performed with intention, from obvious deeds like helping or harming to subtle ones like how you hold your posture, or how carefully you handle things. But the analysis goes deeper than a simple list of actions. Karmic power depends not so much on the external form as on the states of mind that motivate the actions. The same external behavior can yield different results depending on what lies behind it. Greed, hatred, and delusion, or generosity, benevolence, and wisdom. A donation to charity creates good karma if dictated by genuine compassion. But it can create unwholesome karma if the motive is recognition or tax benefits. Speaking the truth is beneficial if the goal is to help a person see reality more clearly, but it can be harmful if the truth is used as a weapon to wound. This emphasis on motivation shows that karma is primarily about the development of consciousness, not about external rewards and punishments. Every intentional action strengthens those mental patterns from which it was born, making similar intentions more likely in the future. Acts of kindness increase the capacity for kindness. Moments of mindfulness develop the inclination toward mindfulness. Choices made from wisdom strengthen wisdom. Conversely, selfishness reinforces selfish tendencies. Anger increases the chance of future anger. Actions from confusion create even more confusion. Karma is how consciousness trains itself through its own choices. Buddha also taught that the results of karma can ripen at different times, depending on the strength of the intention, the character of the action, and the context. Sometimes the consequences are visible immediately in this same life or even on the same day. Harsh words in anger quickly create tension in relationships. Generosity often yields an instantaneous feeling of joy and connection. A lie usually gives birth to anxiety that you will be found out. Other karma may ripen in future lives, remaining in consciousness as seeds waiting for the conditions to sprout. The teaching on karma also includes the cumulative effect of habits. Consciousness develops stable inclinations based on what is regularly repeated. One who habitually responds to difficulties with fear strengthens fearful patterns of perception and reaction, and one who time and again meets difficulties with courage builds confidence and resilience. These tendencies shape not only personal experience, but also what circumstances and relationships a person attracts, because like attracts like at the level of consciousness. From this follows a practical method of change. Instead of trying to break deep-seated habits with willpower, one can systematically draw opposite qualities through repeated intentional practice. Want patience. You consciously train patience in small things until it becomes natural in large ones. Want compassion. You cultivate compassionate thoughts and actions until compassion becomes your default reaction to the pain of others. Such an approach utilizes the natural laws of mental development rather than fighting them. Buddha also emphasized something important. Not all experience is the result of past karma. He spoke of types of suffering that arise for other reasons, from current choices, from natural bodily processes, from external circumstances beyond personal control, and from the basic conditions of living in a body. This prevents the use of karma as an excuse to blame people for their situation, or to justify social inequalities as spiritually deserved. Karma explains part of the experience, but not everything that happens to living beings. The connection between karma and rebirth is one of the most complex topics in Buddhist psychology. Buddha taught that consciousness continues after physical death, and carries with it the karmic formations created by intentional actions throughout lifetimes. These formations influence the conditions of rebirth and the circumstances of future lives. But this must be understood within the framework of his analysis of identity. It is not a solid, unchanging soul that continues to exist, but a stream of conditioned consciousness shaped by accumulated intentions and habits. Rebirth is more like one candle lighting another than a person moving from house to house at the same time, whether one accepts literal rebirth or not. The psychological principles of karma can be verified right now through observation. Every conscious choice shapes the mind that will make future choices. Every intentional action affects the ability to act further. Every moment of mental training changes how consciousness will respond to similar situations in the future. These processes work within a single life, regardless of what will or will not happen after death, and they provide a practical foundation for development without requiring metaphysical beliefs. Buddha also described ways to purify negative karma and accelerate the development of positive karma. Acknowledgement and sincere repentance can neutralize harmful actions, because you see their destructive effect and strengthen the intention not to repeat them. Conscious acts of generosity, kindness, and service can counterbalance selfish tendencies. Meditation and mindfulness can interrupt unconscious reactive patterns before they create new negative karma. And the most powerful thing is the development of insights into the nature of reality, which changes the entire karmic process by showing the constructed nature of the I that supposedly accumulates karma. The goal of understanding karma is not to learn how to cleverly manipulate results, but to develop wisdom that goes beyond the cycle of action and reaction itself. When consciousness recognizes its constructed nature and the interdependence of all phenomena, the obsessive drive to produce karma naturally weakens. Actions continue to occur, but they are born of wisdom and compassion. They cease to be an anchor of a desperate attempt to assert a separate identity. This can be called transcendent karma action that serves the liberation of all beings, without strengthening the illusion of a separate actor. And finally, an important thought. Every moment provides a new opportunity to shape consciousness through conscious choice. It does not matter which patterns were reinforced before. Every moment of awareness allows for the choosing of reactions that lead to greater freedom, wisdom, and compassion. Therefore, the present moment is the most important time for spiritual development. Only now is karma actually created. The past is gone and does not change. The future depends on current choices, and the present moment is alive and filled with the potential for transformation through intention and skillful action. The nature of awareness itself. Part 9. Consciousness is the closest dimension of existence to us, and simultaneously the most mysterious. Everything you have ever experienced happened inside consciousness. Every thought arose in awareness. Every sensation, emotion, and perception appeared in the space of knowing attention. But when you try to investigate consciousness directly, it seems to slip away like mercury. It is difficult to grasp and fixate with ordinary conceptual thinking. Buddha's investigation of the mind is one of the subtlest and deepest parts of his contribution. He showed that consciousness can be both the source of suffering and the key to total liberation. He begins with the distinction between consciousness itself and the contents of consciousness. Ordinary attention is usually so absorbed in what it is aware of that it fails to notice the knowing faculty itself. You are aware of thoughts, but you rarely realize the awareness in which they arise. You experience emotions, but you rarely notice the experiencing itself. You see and hear, but you almost never observe the process of perception that makes perception possible. This constant external focus creates the illusion that consciousness is produced by its content, instead of seeing that the content arises within consciousness. Buddha identified 6 types of consciousness corresponding to the 6 sense doors: visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, bodily, and mental consciousness. Each type arises when the corresponding sense organ meets a suitable object. In the presence of attention, visual consciousness arises when the eye meets form and color and there is attention. Auditory, when the hearing system meets sound waves and awareness is active, and so on. Mental consciousness, the 6th type, rises when the mental organ meets thoughts, memories, emotions, and other mental phenomena, and attention is directed inward. But the analysis goes deeper than a simple listing. Buddha saw that consciousness itself has no built-in characteristics of its own, other than the pure capacity to know, to be aware. Unlike the content, which constantly changes and has specific qualities, color, texture, temperature, emotional tone, consciousness itself is like a clear space. It allows phenomena to appear without being changed by them. A mirror can reflect anything, but the capacity to reflect is not altered by what is reflected. So it is with consciousness. It can be aware of any experience, but the quality of awareness itself remains untouched by the content. This explains why identification with thoughts and emotions creates suffering. When consciousness mistakes itself for its content, it falls under the power of the changes, conflicts, and limitations of that content. If you identify with thoughts, you suffer when anxious thoughts arise, because it seems they threaten who you are. If you identify with emotions, you are tossed up and down because well-being depends on having the right emotions. If you identify with roles and achievements, you become vulnerable to everything that puts these identities at risk, because it seems your very existence is under threat. Buddha showed that this identification is unnecessary and based on delusion. Consciousness does not have to identify with anything at all to maintain its essential nature. As an aware presence, thoughts can arise and disappear without damage to consciousness. Emotions can flow through awareness without destroying its basic stability. Sensations can appear and disappear without changing the capacity to experience them. Recognizing this natural freedom of consciousness from its content is one of the most liberating insights. The practice of direct investigation of consciousness usually begins with the ability to observe the content of awareness without dissolving into it. This is what can be called metacognition, the ability to be aware that you are aware. Instead of simply thinking thoughts, you learn to notice, I am thinking. Instead of simply experiencing emotions, you learn to observe the emotional processes occurring in the space of awareness. This transition from being lost in experience to observing experience creates great psychological freedom because it shows you are not identical to what is currently arising in consciousness. As metacognition develops, people often discover what is called witness consciousness, a quality of presence that observes mental activity and is not troubled by it. This witness is not another thought and not a state of mind, but a built-in capacity of consciousness to know its own content. From this perspective, even the strongest emotions and the most convincing thoughts are seen as temporary appearances in the space of awareness, rather than threats to your essence. This can provide deep relief, because it opens a dimension of being that is naturally calm and invulnerable. But Buddha went even further and asked, is there even an experiencer separate from the experience itself? If you look very carefully for the one who is aware, what do you find? Is there a solid entity that owns consciousness? Or is there simply consciousness that itself creates the feeling of someone who is aware? Often, this investigation shows that the seeming experiencer is also just another experience arising in awareness, no more solid or permanent than any other mental phenomenon. From this can arise what is called non-dual awareness, the understanding that consciousness and its content are ultimately not separate. Awareness and that which is aware turn out to be two sides of the same process. Like the wetness of water or the heat of fire, there is no consciousness separate from what it is aware of, and there is no experience separate from the consciousness in which it appears. This dissolves the habitual subject-object duality and reveals reality as a whole, rather than as a set of separate entities meeting one another. Buddha also explored altered states of consciousness accessible through prolonged meditation. He described a series of increasingly subtle states, the jhanas, with growing concentration, calm, and unification of mind. In them, ordinary mental activity gradually quiets down, and subtler dimensions of consciousness become visible dimensions, usually closed off by the constant chatter of thoughts and the storm of emotions. These states provide a temporary refuge from suffering and simultaneously become a clear platform for investigating awareness itself. The deepest levels of meditative absorption can lead to what Buddha called the cessation of perception, and feeling a temporary stopping of all conscious activity. Those who have experienced this report that consciousness seems to stop completely, yet somehow awareness continues on a level so subtle that it is impossible to describe in ordinary language. This experience looks like direct confirmation that consciousness is not generated by mental activity, but is rather the space in which any activity appears and disappears. That is, awareness is more fundamental than any specific state of consciousness. Buddha also spoke of the connection between individual awareness and universal consciousness, while asserting that every being has its own stream of consciousness, formed by unique karmic formations. At the same time, he suggested that at the deepest level, all consciousness has the same essential nature, just as individual waves are manifestations of one ocean. Individual minds can be understood as manifestations of one universal capacity for awareness. This provides a foundation for true compassion. The suffering of others is recognized as arising in the same field of consciousness that includes your own experience. The practical consequences of such an understanding of consciousness are very direct. When you see that you are not identical to the content of awareness, psychological problems become solvable. They no longer threaten your basic identity. When you discover the natural peace and stability of consciousness itself, external circumstances lose the power to destroy your fundamental well-being. When you catch even a glimpse of the non-dual nature of awareness, the artificial boundary between the self and the world begins to dissolve, and the intimacy and interconnectedness that were always already there manifest. The result of Buddha's investigation of consciousness is in the recognition. Total liberation does not require jumping over consciousness or improving it. One simply needs to recognize its true nature. Consciousness is already free, already peaceful, already whole. The illusion of boundedness and suffering is created by the mistaken identification of consciousness with temporary content, instead of recognizing it as the unchanging space in which any change appears. Liberation is not a new state, but the recognition of that which was actually never bound. The Laboratory of Internal Experience. Part 10. Fragment. Meditation in Buddhism is not just relaxation. Although it can be very peaceful, it is not escapism. Although it provides a respite from internal chaos, it is not self-hypnosis or positive thinking. Although it can change the relationship with difficult thoughts and emotions, Buddhist meditation is a systematic training of awareness itself, a precise methodology for investigating the nature of consciousness and reality through direct observation rather than philosophical guesswork. It is perhaps one of the most advanced technologies for studying the mind that humanity has ever created. Any insight taught by the Buddha can be verified through prolonged, meditative investigation. It is not a matter of faith, but a matter of empirical discovery. The foundation of all Buddhist practices is the development of what is called sati. This is usually translated as mindfulness, but the meaning is broader. Sati includes a clear awareness of the experience of the present moment, the precise recognition of what is actually happening without distortions or extra mental elaborations, continuous attention that does not get lost in the internal commentator, and wise discernment that separates wholesome states of mind from harmful ones. Together, these qualities create a stable platform for the direct investigation of reality, rather than seeing it through the filter of habitual assumptions and reactive patterns. The Buddha identified 4 foundations of mindfulness, a complete framework for training attention and developing understanding. They cover all dimensions of human experience, so that no part of existence remains unconscious or unexamined. Mindfulness of the body includes breath, posture, movement, and bodily sensations. It grounds consciousness in immediate physical reality and provides an anchor against the endless proliferation of thoughts. This foundation teaches one to live fully in the body, rather than existing primarily in concepts and abstractions about one's experience. The practice of mindfulness of breathing deserves special attention. because it often becomes the basis for most Buddhist meditation systems. Breath is an ideal object for concentration. It is always available, natural, rhythmic, closely connected to both the body and the mind, and sufficiently neutral not to trigger strong emotional reactions. But mindfulness of breathing is much more than just counting inhalations, or using breath as a relaxation technique. It involves development. Through mindfulness of breathing, you begin to notice the subtle qualities of each inhalation and exhalation, the natural pauses between them, how the breath changes in response to the state of mind, and, ultimately, how the very attention to the breath rises and disappears in each moment. As mindfulness of breathing develops, people usually discover that what seemed like a simple process actually consists of many subtle phenomena. Each inhalation and exhalation has texture, temperature, rhythm, depth, and quality, and all of this changes from moment to moment depending on both physical and psychological conditions. The space between breaths turns out not to be a void, but also filled with awareness. The connection between breathing and thinking becomes obvious. You see how mental activity changes breathing patterns, and how mindful breathing affects the quality of thoughts and emotions. This discovery of subtlety and interdependence in such an ordinary thing as breathing directly trains the mind to see the profound in the everyday. Mindfulness of feelings. The second foundation is the development of sensitivity to the immediate tone of sensation that accompanies every moment of conscious experience. Even before you recognize exactly what you are experiencing, and before you begin to tell yourself a story about what it means, there is a fraction of a second of pure sensation, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This tone arises automatically and is not a problem in itself, but it immediately triggers habitual schemes of craving and resistance, from which psychological suffering is constructed. Learning to notice the tone directly, before the automatic reaction kicks in, is the key to breaking the cycle of thirst, which the Buddha called the root of suffering. Observing the tone of sensation requires very high precision and patience, because these phenomena are subtle and brief. A pleasant tone may last only a few seconds, before it is overwritten by clinging, and the fear of losing the pleasantness. An unpleasant tone is quickly covered by resistance, and stories about why this should not be happening. A neutral tone is often not noticed at all, because the mind immediately begins to search for something more interesting or stimulating. The ability to catch these tones before reactive templates are launched is like learning to see a spark before it ignites a fire. Mindfulness of the mind. The third foundation is to step back from the content of consciousness and observe the processes of consciousness as such. Instead of getting lost in specific thoughts or emotions, you develop the ability to recognize different states of mind as they arise and go. You learn to observe anger without becoming angry, to notice fear without falling into it, to see desire without following it. This is what modern psychologists call cognitive diffusion, the ability to observe mental phenomena without falling under their automatic control. This aspect of the practice shows that most suffering arises not from the presence of difficult thoughts and emotions, but from the belief that you are whatever has just arisen in consciousness. When you can see anxiety as a temporary guest in awareness rather than as something that defines you, the anxiety may remain unpleasant, but it ceases to threaten your basic sense of identity and well-being. When you can observe how angry thoughts rise and dissolve like clouds in the sky of mindfulness, anger loses much of its compulsive power, because you no longer merge with it. This shift from I am my thoughts and emotions to I am observing thoughts and emotions is one of the most transformative things meditation can provide. Mindfulness of phenomena. The fourth foundation is to observe how any experience arises and dissolves according to natural laws rather than personal preferences. This includes investigating the three characteristics that the Buddha described as universal properties of conditioned existence: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, suffering, and the absence of a fixed self. Through steady observation, you begin to see these characteristics in real time, rather than just understanding them with your head. You see how thoughts arise from nowhere and go back to nowhere, how emotions appear and disappear without anyone specifically turning them on or off, how sensations constantly change without a central controller conducting the changes. This direct observation of how phenomena behave independently of your desires gradually undermines the illusion that you control the experience, or that the experience is obliged to correspond to your desires. This is not a depressive discovery, but a very liberating one. It shows that the time spent trying to control the uncontrollable was redundant. From the very beginning, one can relax into the natural flow of experience instead of exhausting oneself with attempts to fit everything to one's preferences. This relaxation is not passive surrender, but a wise alignment with how reality actually works. The Buddha also taught practices for developing concentration, the ability to hold attention on a single object for a long time without distraction and without dullness. If mindfulness is an open attentiveness to everything that arises, then concentration is focused attention that gradually unifies the mind and reveals increasingly subtle levels of consciousness. The Buddha described 8 levels of concentrated absorption, the jhanas. Each is characterized by certain qualities of joy, peace, and unity of mind. These states provide both temporary relief from psychological suffering and a stable platform for deep insights into the nature of reality. The first jhana arises when the mind becomes so immersed in the object of meditation that ordinary internal chatter quiets down and is replaced by steady attention accompanied by joy and bodily pleasure. This state can be surprisingly blissful and directly shows that happiness does not necessarily require external stimulation. It can be cultivated by training the mind itself. The second jhana occurs when even the effort needed to maintain concentration dissolves. Pure joy and tranquility remain. The third and fourth jhanas are increasingly subtle states of peace and equanimity, where even joy is recognized as a form of mental activity that eventually becomes unnecessary. Beyond the 4 jhanas, the Buddha described 4 more formless absorptions, where attention goes beyond bodily sensations and rests in increasingly refined dimensions of consciousness. Immersion in infinite space is associated with the recognition that awareness itself is boundless. Immersion in infinite consciousness involves the recognition that this boundless awareness is also alive and knowing. Immersion in nothingness brings the discovery that even consciousness in the habitual sense is not the deepest level. The state of neither perception nor non-perception points to such subtle dimensions of awareness that they are difficult to describe in ordinary language. Although these concentrated states can be very peaceful and insightful, the Buddha emphasized that they are not goals in themselves, but tools for developing wisdom leading to total liberation. Some practitioners become so attached to blissful states that they mistake them for enlightenment. But the Buddha pointed out, these are still conditioned experiences. They arise and disappear. Genuine liberation is the understanding of the nature of all conditioned states, including the most refined meditative absorptions, rather than attachment to some level of consciousness. The jhanas strongly support the practice of insight, but insight itself must be grown through the mindful investigation of how all phenomena arise and dissolve according to natural laws. The Buddha also taught walking meditation as a supplement to sitting practice, recognizing that consciousness needs to be trained in both stillness and movement. Walking meditation is the same mindfulness as with breathing while sitting, but directed toward the simple act of stepping. You observe the lifting, moving, and placing of the foot, the shifting of weight from leg to leg, the movement of muscles and joints, and the coordination necessary for balance in motion. This helps to integrate meditative awareness into everyday life and removes a typical mistake, thinking that mindfulness is only possible in formal meditation sessions. Integration of practice with daily life is one of the most important aspects of Buddhist training. The insights and skills developed in formal practice must gradually spread to all types of activities if they are to change consciousness permanently, rather than just providing temporary relief. This happens through bringing mindfulness into routine actions: eating, cleaning, walking, and even speaking and listening in conversations. Over time, the boundary between meditation and life dissolves, Awareness becomes continuous, rather than something that is switched on and off according to a schedule. The Buddha concluded the teaching of meditation by recognizing that, ultimately, there is no meditator, no meditation technique, and no goal to be achieved. These are conventional designations, useful at the start, but as practice matures, they must be transcended. What remains is simply awareness, aware of its self-consciousness, directly recognizing its own nature, without the mediation of concepts and techniques. This is the fruit of the practice, not the achievement of some special state, but the recognition of what was always already present beneath the layers of mental constructs, and searching. The Ethics of Awakening. Part 11. Ethics of Awakening in Buddhism arises not from divine commandments or social agreements, but from a clear vision of the nature of reality and the consequences of different actions. When you understand how deeply everything is interconnected, causing harm to others becomes as self-destructive as causing harm to yourself. When you see that the ego, which supposedly gains from selfish behavior, is itself a construct, the motivation for such behavior naturally diminishes. When you directly observe how much suffering arises from actions rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion, the development of generosity, love, and wisdom becomes not a moral duty, but a manifestation of sanity. The foundation of Buddhist ethics consists of what the Buddha called the three roots of wholesome action: non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. This is not merely the absence of the bad, but positive states with their own properties and benefits. Non-greed manifests as generosity, contentment, and the ability to appreciate what is, instead of an endless need more. Non-hatred manifests as benevolence, patience, and the ability to respond to difficulties with wisdom rather than reactivity. Non-delusion manifests as clarity, understanding, and the skill to see situations as they are, rather than through the distortions of hope or fear. The practice of generosity, called dana, holds a special place because it directly counteracts the clinging mind that creates so much suffering. Generosity is not just about giving away material things. It is a shift from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance. When you hold tightly to things, experiences, and even ideas, tension and anxiety rise. When you let go, space appears for greater happiness and freedom. Authentic generosity gives without expectation of return, without keeping score, and without using giving as a way to gain approval or control. The Buddha identified levels of generosity corresponding to the degree of spiritual development. The initial level is giving while still feeling attachment to what is given, perhaps hoping for recognition or feeling proud of one's charity. The middle level is giving more freely but maintaining the sense of I am a generous person, doing good for worthy people. The advanced level is going beyond duality, the giver, the gift, and the receiver, understanding that the boundaries between self and others are constructs that limit the natural flow of care and support. The practice of loving kindness, metta, is another pillar of ethics. But metta for the Buddha is not sentimentality or forced friendliness. It is a specific mental training that systematically removes the barriers between you and other beings. Usually, it begins with sincere benevolence toward oneself. It is impossible to truly care for others if you are constantly at war with your own mind and emotions. Such kindness toward oneself is not indulgence, but a rational care that creates the internal stability necessary for effective care of others. When benevolence toward oneself is established, the practice expands first to loved ones, then to neutral people, then to difficult people, and finally to all living beings. This expansion challenges the habit of dividing the world into us and them, friend and enemy, worthy and unworthy. Practice shows that these divisions are arbitrary. They limit the capacity for connection and happiness, while increasing stress and conflict. As the heart includes more and more beings, the artificial boundaries that create loneliness and alienation naturally dissolve. The Buddha also taught how to work with anger and resentment, recognizing that they particularly hinder the development of benevolence. The traditional approach is neither to suppress anger nor to indulge it, but to understand it clearly enough to transform its energy. Anger often arises because something valuable to us matters, and it seems to be under threat. That is, there is information within anger about our values and cares. A skillful reaction is to extract this information and release the destructive emotional charge that makes anger harmful to both oneself and others. One powerful method is to investigate the stories that fuel the anger. Anger rarely arises from the situations themselves. More often, it comes from their interpretations, especially interpretations where someone is intentionally trying to harm or acting against how things should be. When you carefully examine these stories, it often turns out they are built on assumptions about other people's motives that may be incorrect. Most people are doing the best they can based on their understanding and circumstances, even when their actions create problems for you. This does not justify the harm, but it removes an additional layer of suffering that comes from taking other people's actions personally. Compassion, karuna, rests on benevolence and adds a skillful response to suffering wherever it is encountered. Benevolence wishes for beings to be happy. Compassion specifically wishes for liberation from suffering and acts so that this becomes possible. Real compassion requires strength and wisdom. It is the willingness to encounter suffering directly without being overwhelmed by it, and to respond from clarity rather than emotional reactivity. Sometimes compassion looks tough, for example, when one must say no to requests that fuel destructive patterns, or refuse to participate in collective self-deceptions that provide temporary comforts but cause long-term harm. The Buddha distinguished between conventionally emotional compassion and the compassion of wisdom. Emotional compassion feels the pain of others and wants to remove it immediately. This can lead to burnout, codependency, and reactions that ultimately increase suffering. The compassion of wisdom understands the causes of suffering and responds in a way that addresses the causes, not just the symptoms. This may mean allowing a person to experience the natural consequences of their actions, instead of rescuing them, or providing support and guidance for skill development rather than just consolation. Such compassion is sustainable. It is not built on the need to fix everyone, but focuses on creating conditions in which people develop their own wisdom and strength. Sympathetic joy, mudita, is one of the most difficult practices for most people. It is the ability to sincerely rejoice in the happiness and success of others, even when their luck seems to diminish your own opportunities or highlights your limitations. This practice directly confronts the comparing mind, which constantly evaluates your position relative to others and creates suffering through envy, jealousy, and competition. The capacity to rejoice in another's good fortune regardless of your own circumstances is a profound transition from a consciousness of scarcity to a consciousness of abundance. Mudita shows how much psychic energy is usually spent on comparing oneself with others, and on feelings of superiority or inferiority. When you can rejoice in others' achievements without feeling diminished, and appreciate others' qualities without feeling inferior, a vast inner space opens for your own development and contribution. This is not about indifference toward your own goals, but about moving toward them from internal abundance rather than desperate competition. Mudita transforms relationships from a zero-sum game into a collective celebration of the fact that the potential for happiness and realization exists for all conscious beings. Equanimity, upekkha, is the pinnacle of ethical development and the foundation of all other qualities. It is not indifference or cold detachment, but a balanced awareness that remains clear and responsive regardless of circumstances. Within it lies the wisdom to distinguish what can be skillfully influenced from what must be accepted as it is, the strength to maintain calm in chaos, the flexibility to respond adequately to constantly changing conditions. Equanimity allows one to care deeply for the well-being of all beings, while maintaining a perspective on the long-term nature of development and one's own limited role in it. The Buddha also gave specific guidelines for behavior that support the development of these qualities of the heart. The 5 precepts: abstaining from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and the use of intoxicants that cloud clarity. These are not arbitrary rules imposed from the outside, but practical recommendations based on an understanding of how different actions affect consciousness and relationships. Each precept, observed with wisdom rather than a rigid letter of the law, creates conditions for greater peace, trust, and clarity in personal experience and social communication. The precept not to kill goes beyond obvious violence and includes all forms of unnecessary harm to living beings. This includes mindfulness of how one's lifestyle affects other beings, how words can wound psychologically, and how internal attitudes can fuel a culture of aggression and insensitivity. The positive side of this precept is to actively develop respect for life in all forms, and to seek ways to support the flourishing of other beings, not just avoiding harm. This may manifest in the choice of food and products that reduce ecological damage, in speech that supports rather than degrades, and in mental settings that serve life rather than destruction. Buddhist ethics concludes with a recognition. Authentic morality is inseparable from wisdom and mental training. Ethical behavior held up only by willpower often becomes rigid, judgmental, and eventually breaks when conditions become difficult. Ethics arising from an understanding of interconnectedness and the consequences of actions becomes a natural expression of wisdom, rather than an external restriction of impulses. Then ethics is felt not as a burden, but as a source of joy and fulfillment that expands, rather than contracts. Authentic self-expression. The flowering of understanding. Buddha recognized that different people need different approaches to awakening due to temperament, life circumstances, and psychological development. From this, various schools and traditions of Buddhism emerged. Each emphasizes specific aspects of the complete teaching while preserving the core, the understanding of suffering, its causes, and the path to liberation. This is not a contradiction or a distortion, but a manifestation of the richness and adaptability of Buddha's key discoveries about consciousness and reality. Understanding these directions helps in choosing methods that suit you personally, while simultaneously allowing you to see the wisdom in approaches that might be unfamiliar to your disposition. Theravada, the teaching of the elders, emphasizes individual liberation through the systematic training of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. It relies primarily on the teachings of the historical Buddha preserved in the Pali Canon, and asserts that enlightenment is achieved through personal effort, and cannot be granted by external forces. Theravada practices usually emphasize the mindful observation of the arising and passing away of phenomena, and the development of direct experience of the three characteristics: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self, rather than purely conceptual analysis. This tradition is well suited for those who like clear and practical instructions, and are motivated by the goal of personal liberation from suffering. The path is usually described as a sequence of clearly defined stages of awakening, ever-deepening levels of understanding and freedom from the patterns that create suffering. The first stage is called stream entry. This is the moment when consciousness receives a direct, stable insight into several fundamental truths of existence. Those who have entered the stream do not eliminate all suffering at once, but they see through the basic delusions that sustain suffering. Therefore, further progress becomes inevitable, even if it takes many lifetimes to complete. Furthermore, the second and third stages are associated with the gradual weakening of craving and aversion, and the fourth with total liberation from psychological suffering. Mahayana, the great vehicle, emphasizes the liberation of all beings rather than just personal awakening, proceeding from the recognition that personal and universal freedom are ultimately inseparable. Here, the ideal of the Bodhisattva appears, one who takes a vow to work for the awakening of all conscious beings, and may even postpone their own final liberation to continue helping others. Mahayana philosophy develops the analysis of emptiness, the understanding that phenomena do not possess their own unchanging essence and arise only in dependence upon causes, conditions, and conceptual labeling. This tradition is often close to people who are naturally inclined towards service, and see their development as inseparable from the well-being of others. The understanding of emptiness in Mahayana extends to all phenomena, not just personal identity. Nothing exists independently. Everything arises in a complex web of interdependent relationships. When this insight becomes deep, it dissolves the artificial boundaries between self and world, the sacred and the mundane, samsara and nirvana, revealing reality as a continuous whole. The recognition of universal emptiness becomes the foundation of limitless compassion, because the barriers between your welfare and the welfare of others are revealed as conceptual constructs rather than ultimate reality. Within Mahayana, Pure Land Buddhism offers a path particularly suited to those who feel overwhelmed by the difficulty of achieving enlightenment through personal effort alone. It emphasizes devotion to Amida Buddha, a fully awakened being who created a pure realm where conditions ideally support spiritual development. Through sincere faith and the practice of reciting Amida's name, practitioners can be born into this pure land, where enlightenment is much more accessible than in a world of distractions and obstacles. This path transforms the spiritual journey from a solitary struggle into a partnership with awakened wisdom, which is constantly available as support and guidance. Zen, which emerged at the intersection of Indian Mahayana and Chinese Taoist sensibility, emphasizes a direct pointing to the nature of the mind without reliance on words, concepts, or the gradual accumulation of techniques. Zen practice often includes intense retreats, work with paradoxical stories and tasks called koans, and dialogue with qualified teachers capable of recognizing and confirming authentic insight. This tradition attracts those who prefer the immediate experience of understanding and are ready for intense practice without the need for detailed explanations of exactly how it works. Its idea the ordinary mind is the ways close to those who suspect that enlightenment is not an exotic achievement, but the recognition of what has always been right there. Koans in Zen training deserve special attention. They are a specific method that helps transcend conceptual thinking and break through to direct seeing. Koans are not riddles for intellectual solving, but spiritual exercises that exhaust habitual ways of processing information and create windows for non-conceptual understanding. Classic koans, such as what is the sound of one hand clapping, or what was your original face before your parents were born, cannot be solved by logic. They require a transition to a completely different way of knowing. Working with koans teaches one to see the limitations of conceptual thinking and develops trust in the mind's capacity for direct intuitive clarity. Tibetan Buddhism preserved and developed the most extensive set of teachings and practices, integrating elements of previous traditions and adding sophisticated psychological methods originating from Indian tantric lineages. It proceeds from the premise that people are at different stages of development, and therefore offers a stepped system of the path with practices for beginners, intermediates, and advanced students. The Tibetan approach is known for its detailed analysis of mental states and emotions, systematic work with compassion and wisdom, and visualization practices that directly use the mind's ability to create and transform reality through imagination. One of the compassion practices is the exchange of self and others, Tonglen, the intentional taking in of the suffering of others and sending out relief and happiness, which directly counteracts the egoistic habit of avoiding pain and seeking pleasure only for oneself. From the outside, this might look masochistic or psychologically harmful, but when performed correctly, the practice shows that most suffering is resistance to natural human emotions like sadness, fear, and disappointment. By learning to breathe with difficult feelings instead of fighting them, a person develops the ability to be present with suffering without being flooded by it. Tantric elements provide advanced methods for those who already have sufficient stability and an ethical foundation to work safely with powerful psychological energies. These methods recognize that the same energies that create suffering when expressed unconsciously can become the vehicle for rapid spiritual development when directed consciously. Tantra includes complex visualizations, mantras, and ritual actions involving body, speech, and mind in the process of transformation. Such an approach is particularly suitable for people who find it easier to learn through engagement and activity rather than only through still observation. Modern Western adaptations of Buddhist practice most often focus on meditation techniques and psychological insights, and usually de-emphasize elements like rebirth, devotion, and complex philosophical systems. This has made the methods accessible to those who do not relate to traditional Asian religious forms, while preserving practices that directly reduce psychological suffering. Approaches like MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, acceptance and commitment therapy and other directions show that Buddhist insights can be separated from their cultural context without losing their transformative power. This supports the idea that Buddha's discoveries about awareness and suffering are universal principles, not culture-specific beliefs. The diversity of traditions shows there is no single right way to apply the teaching. There are many skillful approaches, adaptable to different people, cultures, and eras. At the same time, in all authentic schools, a common recognition remains that suffering is born from a misunderstanding of the nature of reality, and that this misunderstanding can be corrected by systematic training of awareness, ethics, and wisdom. Methods may vary greatly, but basic insights into impermanence, interdependence, and the constructed nature of personal identity remain constant. This flexibility allows Buddhist wisdom to evolve and adapt to new conditions, remaining effective in reducing human suffering. Stages of liberation. Part 13. Awakening is not one dramatic moment, but a gradual process of seeing through the illusions that create suffering. It has discernible stages that reflect the growth of freedom and understanding. Buddha described this process with high precision, which insights correspond to different levels of realization and what psychological changes occur when consciousness recognizes its true nature. Understanding the stages gives the practitioner both support and realistic expectations, helping one not to lose heart at slow progress and not to make premature claims of achievement when insights are still partial. Most importantly, these stages show that liberation is not about reaching an exotic state, but about the gradual letting go of mental constructs that obscure the natural peace and freedom that are always already present. The first significant milestone is stream entry. This is the moment when consciousness receives a direct, unshakable insight into several fundamental truths of existence. Those who have entered the stream do not eliminate all suffering, but they see through the basic delusions that support it. Therefore, further progress becomes inevitable, even if many lifetimes are needed for completion. This stage is described through three key realizations that permanently change one's relationship to experience: a direct understanding of the impermanence of all conditioned phenomena, a bodily sensory recognition that seeking stable satisfaction in external experiences is futile, and a clear vision of the constructed nature of personal identity. Insight into impermanence becomes not just intellectual agreement, but a felt reality. Everything experienced through the six senses arises and dissolves with great speed. This destroys the illusion of permanence, the unconscious assumption that things exist as solid, stable entities rather than as dynamic processes. When this illusion is shattered by direct observation, consciousness can no longer cling to experiences as desperately, because it becomes obvious there is nothing to grasp. Preference and the human tendency to enjoy the pleasant do not disappear, but the panicked attempt to make the temporary permanent vanishes. Realizing the futility of seeking ultimate satisfaction in conditioned experiences is perhaps the most practical insight of this stage. Stream enter. See directly. Any experience, no matter how pleasant and meaningful it may be, carries within it the seeds of unsatisfactoriness, because no experience can provide the unconditional fulfillment that consciousness unconsciously seeks. This does not lead to nihilism or withdrawal from life, but rather changes motivation. Instead of accumulating experiences as a way to become happy, an orientation toward happiness that is independent of specific conditions emerges. This removes the basic anxiety that drives impulsive behavior and opens a space for more honest participation in any situation. Understanding the constructed nature of personal identity dissolves what is called personality view, the belief in a solid, continuous self existing independently of changing conditions. This does not mean that stream enters lose the ability to function in society, or stop using habitual forms of self-reference. They understand that personal identity is a useful convention, not an ultimate reality. It is like lines of latitude and longitude. They help with navigation, but do not exist as physical objects. This removes the sharp edge of self-concern. There is less of a sense that there is a solid entity that needs to be defended or endlessly improved. Stream enters also gain stable trust in the three jewels. The Buddha as the one who discovered and transmitted the path of liberation, the Dharma as the truth about reality and the methods of its realization, and the Sangha as the community of practitioners supporting one another. This is not blind faith, but empirical trust based on direct verification. The path works as described. They have tasted liberation and know that total freedom from suffering is possible, because they have experienced it partially. This provides steady motivation to continue the practice, even in the face of slow progress and obstacles. Behavioral changes associated with this stage include a natural inability to perform actions that cause serious harm to oneself or others. This is not malady from the outside, but an ethics arising from an understanding of interconnectedness. Stream enters are incapable of consciously killing, stealing, or performing other deeds that create significant suffering, because they understand bodily harm to others is harm to the entire web of existence of which they are a part. They also naturally avoid extremes, both rigid asceticism and unrestrained indulgence, since they see directly that neither the suppression of natural needs nor the compulsive gratification of desires leads to freedom. The second stage, once returning, is associated with a significant weakening of the emotional patterns that create interpersonal conflicts and internal turbulence. Greed, hatred, and delusion have not yet disappeared completely, but their purity and intensity are greatly reduced. Anger, desire, and confusion rise less frequently, and when they do rise, they are less intrusive and dissolve faster without triggering the habitual cascades of reactions. The third stage, non-returning, signifies the total elimination of the craving and aversion that bind consciousness to the sphere of sensory desires. At this stage, the psychological schemes of clinging to the pleasant and resisting the unpleasant disappear, and equanimity becomes deep and stable regardless of external conditions. The restless search characteristic of ordinary consciousness disappears, because a fullness is discovered that does not depend on the presence or absence of specific conditions. Traditionally, it is said that non-returners are not born again in human form, because the desires and fears that shape human existence have been resolved once and for all. The fourth and final stage, arhatship or liberation, is the total cessation of psychological suffering through a perfected understanding of the true nature of reality. For arhats, the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion have been extinguished so completely that they can no longer rise under any circumstances. This is not emotional numbness, but perfect responsiveness. Actions arise spontaneously out of wisdom and compassion, without the distortions of self-concern. Arhats realize the Buddha's promise that suffering can end completely, and show through their own experience that human consciousness possesses a vast potential for freedom and peace. Psychological signs of total liberation include, for example, the unshakable liberation of the mind, a peace so deep that it cannot be disturbed by either external circumstances or internal states. Also, a total confidence in one's own understanding, not out of arrogance, but from a thorough investigation of reality, after which doubts about the nature of existence are resolved once and for all. Ethics becomes spontaneous. There is no need to weigh actions because motivations stem from wisdom, rather than from conflicting desires and fears. The so-called divine abodes develop limitless benevolence, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity extending to all beings without exception. These are not emotions in the usual sense, but stable qualities of consciousness that arise naturally when the barriers of self-concern, essentially David concerns sick, are dissolved. The love of an arhat does not depend on whether other people are pleasant. Their compassion is not diminished by another's resistance to help. Joy for the happiness of others is not contaminated by comparison and envy. Equanimity does not waver due to praise or criticism, success or failure, pleasure or pain. This is the full flowering of human emotional potential, liberated from the distortion of unconscious reactivity. The Buddha also described how, against the background of deep meditative realizations, various psychic abilities can develop, including mind reading, remembering past lives, and perceiving the karmic patterns influencing the experience of beings. However, he constantly emphasized that these are byproducts of development, not goals. Attachment to them can hinder progress toward liberation. The main result is not extraordinary abilities, but the ordinary miracle of a consciousness free from the compulsive patterns that create suffering. A fully liberated person may possess such abilities or appear perfectly ordinary, but in either case, the qualities of deep peace, wisdom, and compassion will be evident. Modern practitioners sometimes doubt whether these traditional stages are relevant today, or whether they are cultural artifacts of another era. Many modern teachers and researchers generally confirm that such patterns of development continue to be encountered now, though they may manifest differently depending on culture and circumstances. The described insights appear to be universal features of the development of consciousness, rather than the beliefs of an ancient Indian society. These stages can serve as useful navigation for modern practice, while maintaining openness to the fact that awakening in the modern world may include dimensions that traditional descriptions emphasized less. Rest peacefully, knowing that the same intelligence that guides your breath, beats your heart, and creates your dreams is capable of guiding you in wakefulness as well. When you remember how to listen, how to let go, and how to be steady without struggle. Good night.